Richard Dunn sank into his first-class seat with a sigh, loosening his tie as he settled in for what he expected to be a quiet flight back to Tampa. The cabin was filled with the subtle scent of cologne and freshly brewed coffee, the murmurs of businessmen checking stock prices, and the rustle of polished leather briefcases being tucked into overhead bins. This was his space, where men like him, who had worked their way up the corporate ladder, could finally relax, even if only for a few hours. The last 3 days had been exhausting, filled with meetings that led nowhere and clients who wanted the world on a shoestring budget. But now, at least, he had a reprieve. That was until she arrived. A young woman, mid to late 20s, slid into the seat beside him, carrying nothing but a sleek tablet and an air of quiet focus. Her outfit was neat but understated, a black blazer over a white top, her blonde hair pulled back effortlessly. No designer logos, no flashy jewelry, nothing that screamed money. Yet here she was, sitting in first class as if she belonged. Richard exhaled sharply, already making assumptions. Another privileged trust fund kid playing at being important. He'd seen them before, the kind who never had to work for anything, who floated through life without a care because their last name did all the heavy lifting for them. He had built his career from the ground up, clawing his way into rooms like this. Meanwhile, kids like her waltzed in, never knowing what it was like to truly struggle. He smirked, shaking his head as he muttered under his breath, "Must be nice." She didn't react, didn't even glance in his direction. That irked him. He wasn't used to being ignored. People usually had something to say when he spoke, whether they agreed, tried to justify themselves, or pushed back. But she just kept her attention on her tablet, her fingers moving efficiently across the screen. That only made him more curious and more convinced that she had nothing of substance to do. He turned slightly toward her, deciding to push a little harder. "The daddy's money, huh?" he said, feigning casual conversation. "First class for a weekend getaway?" This time she did look up, but only for a second. Her expression was unreadable, neither annoyed nor flustered, just neutral. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, her tone polite but distant, as if she were addressing an unremarkable inconvenience. Richard chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if he had already figured her out. "It's just funny," he said, tilting his head slightly. "People work their whole lives to afford a seat like this. Meanwhile, some of us just get handed it on a silver platter." She held his gaze for a brief moment, then gave the smallest of smiles. Not amused, not offended, just polite. Then, without another word, she turned back to her tablet, her attention completely shifting away from him. That irritated him even more. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because she wasn't trying to prove him wrong, maybe because she wasn't embarrassed, or maybe because she just didn't care. Most people, when confronted, would feel the need to justify themselves, to explain their presence, to reassure others that they weren't just some rich kid who had gotten lucky. But she wasn't playing the game, and that, for some reason, got under his skin. A flight attendant passed by, offering champagne to the first-class passengers. Richard took his glass without hesitation. The woman beside him declined, her focus still on whatever she was working on. He raised an eyebrow. "Not a champagne fan?" he asked, forcing an easygoing tone. "I have work to do," she replied simply. He scoffed before he could stop himself. "Work? Sure." He leaned back in his seat, shaking his head as he took a sip of champagne, convinced now more than ever that he had her figured out. This was just another entitled 20-something who wanted to look important, wanted to sit among executives and businessmen, wanted to pretend she had earned her place in a world she had never actually struggled to enter. And yet, despite everything, she didn't rise to the bait. She remained quiet, composed, unbothered. That was what frustrated him the most. He turned his attention to his phone, scrolling through emails, but every so often, his eyes flicked toward her screen. Documents, emails, structured notes, not the kind of thing a spoiled rich girl would be reading if she was just killing time between shopping sprees. Still, he wasn't convinced. He had spent his life reading people, and he had never been wrong before. She didn't belong here. Not really. What Richard didn't realize, what he wouldn't realize until much later, was that he had already lost this unspoken battle the moment he assumed he knew her story. And soon, The truth would hit him harder than he could have ever imagined. Karoline Leavitt remained composed, her fingers moving steadily across the tablet screen, her focus unwavering despite the businessman beside her, who had clearly decided she was worth his unsolicited commentary. Richard Dunn had expected a reaction, some sign that his remarks had landed, a flicker of annoyance, or at the very least, an attempt to justify herself. But Karoline didn't flinch. She hadn't rolled her eyes, hadn't sighed in exasperation, hadn't even offered him the dignity of an argument. Instead, she had given him a polite but distant response before returning to her work, as if he were nothing more than the hum of the airplane engine. Background noise, unimportant, irrelevant. That, more than anything, irritated Richard. He wasn't used to being ignored. When he spoke, people listened. In meetings, in boardrooms, in first-class cabins just like this, his words carried weight. But this woman, who looked young enough to still be figuring out the real world, had dismissed him without effort, without so much as batting an eye. The realization festered, irritating him more than he cared to admit. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his posture as if somehow that would reassert the control he felt slipping. His eyes flicked toward her screen again, taking in the structured emails and what appeared to be briefing notes. He scoffed under his breath. Briefing notes for what? The next shopping trip? A social media strategy session for whatever influencer project she had cooked up? He'd seen this before. Young professionals who pretended to be busy, their screens filled with nonsense, their importance self-inflated. He turned slightly toward her again, determined to push just a little harder. "Work, huh?" he said, feigning casual interest. "I mean, I guess everyone needs a hobby." This time she did look up, but only briefly. Her expression remained unreadable, her features calm and composed. "It's not a hobby," she replied simply. Richard chuckled. Sure, he said, nodding slightly, taking another sip of champagne. "Not everyone needs to work, though. I mean, let's be real. Most people your age in first class aren't exactly here because they spent years grinding away at a career." Karoline didn't reply. She didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes, didn't do any of the things Richard might have expected. Instead, she just resumed typing, unbothered, as if his words carried no weight at all. That only made him more irritated. He leaned back in his seat, setting his champagne glass down with a little too much force, the stem clinking against the tray table. He had spent his entire life reading people, breaking them down within moments of meeting them. It was a skill that had served him well, in business and in life. And yet, for some reason, this woman was unreadable. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way she was, not shy, not intimidated, not passive, but completely, entirely indifferent, as if his opinion, his presence, his assumptions meant absolutely nothing. Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You know," he said, tapping a finger against his armrest, "most people in your position would at least try to prove themselves." Karoline didn't even look at him this time. "Most people in your position," she countered, her tone neutral, "wouldn't expect that." That stopped him, just for a second. The words were delivered so smoothly, so effortlessly, that it took him a moment to even process the quiet bite hidden beneath them. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't upset. She wasn't interested in proving him wrong. She was simply uninterested in him. That, for Richard, was a foreign concept. He was used to people trying to gain his approval, trying to impress him, or at the very least acknowledging his presence. But Karoline? She had dismissed him without dismissing him. She hadn't argued, hadn't engaged, hadn't even tried to correct him. She had simply let him sit in his own assumptions. And for some reason that was worse than if she had outright humiliated him. A flight attendant passed by again, and Richard watched as she stopped at their row, offering a polite smile, but not to him. "Miss Leavitt," the flight attendant said, her voice warm, respectful. "It's an honor to have you on board." Richard blinked. The shift was immediate, the energy in the air suddenly changing. Karoline looked up, offering the flight attendant a gracious smile, one that was genuine but composed. "Thank you," she said simply. The attendant hesitated for just a moment, then added, "I just wanted to say, your last speech, really powerful. A lot of us respect what you're doing." Richard's stomach twisted slightly. "Speech? What speech?" But Karoline, ever composed, simply nodded in appreciation. "That means a lot, thank you." And just like that, the conversation was over. The flight attendant moved on, and Richard was left sitting there, silent for the first time. The name nagged at him. Leavitt. He had heard it before, somewhere, maybe in passing, maybe on the news, but he couldn't place it. He shifted in his seat, suddenly feeling the fabric of his blazer a little tighter, the space around him a little smaller. He glanced toward Karoline again, watching as she tapped something on her tablet, completely unfazed by what had just happened. Across the aisle, another passenger, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a well-tailored navy suit, had picked up on the exchange. He peered over the top of his reading glasses, studying Karoline for a moment, before his eyebrows lifted in recognition. "Excuse me," the man said, leaning slightly toward them. "But aren't you Karoline Leavitt?" Richard turned his head sharply, his stomach dropping before she even answered. Karoline looked up again, offering the same small, polite nod she had given the flight attendant. "Yes, I am." The man's smile widened, clearly impressed. "Well, I'll be damned. You were the White House press secretary, weren't you?" And just like that, Richard Dunn felt the floor disappear beneath him. Richard Dunn's world shifted in an instant. One moment he had been sitting comfortably in his first-class seat, basking in his own assumptions, convinced he had figured out the young woman beside him. The next, the weight of realization settled in his chest like a stone, pressing down with a force he hadn't anticipated. Karoline Leavitt. The name was suddenly everywhere. Whispers rippling through the cabin, stolen glances from other passengers, the unmistakable murmur of recognition that came when someone important was in the room. Richard, who prided himself on always knowing who was who, had somehow been the last to realize it. The businessman across the aisle, the one with the salt and pepper hair and the tailored navy suit, looked genuinely impressed. "I followed your career," he said, smiling warmly. "Your interviews, the way you handled the media, impressive stuff. And so young, too. You've made quite a name for yourself." Richard's stomach tightened. White House press secretary. The words echoed in his head as he replayed everything he had said to her, every condescending remark, every smug assumption. He had mocked her for sitting in first class, assumed she was nothing more than another rich kid enjoying the luxuries of a life she hadn't worked for. Meanwhile, she had held one of the most demanding and scrutinized positions in American politics, standing behind the White House podium fielding questions from the toughest journalists in the world. And she had done it with the same quiet, unshaken composure she was displaying now. She wasn't some privileged 20-something playing pretend. She was a force, a professional, a woman who had earned her place in rooms far more important than this first-class cabin. And she had let him talk. She hadn't corrected him. She hadn't defended herself. She hadn't thrown her title in his face. She had simply let him walk himself into his own humiliation. Richard's mouth had gone dry. He kept his eyes on his phone screen, pretending to read an email, but the words blurred together, unreadable. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the passengers around them had tuned into the conversation, some whispering, others simply watching. He wasn't the center of attention anymore. She was. And she hadn't even tried to be. The businessman across the aisle chuckled, shaking his head as he leaned back in his seat. "You're probably used to people recognizing you," he said to Karoline. "I imagine it must be exhausting dealing with public perception all the time." Karoline gave a small, knowing smile. "It has its moments," she said simply. Richard finally forced himself to speak, though his voice was noticeably tighter than before. "So, White House press secretary, huh? I didn't realize." Karoline turned to him, her expression still unreadable. "You didn't ask." The words landed like a slap. It wasn't an attack, wasn't said with malice, wasn't even meant to humiliate him. It was just a fact. She had let him assume, let him run his mouth, let him reveal his arrogance all on his own. Richard forced a chuckle, trying to recover. "Well, I guess I made a bit of an assumption earlier." She didn't reassure him, didn't let him off the hook. She simply waited, watching as he struggled for a way out of the embarrassment settling in his chest. He cleared his throat, shifting again in his seat. "It's just that, You don't exactly look like—" He hesitated, realizing too late that he had started a sentence he didn't know how to finish. Karoline arched an eyebrow, calm but unyielding. "Like I belong here?" The businessman across the aisle smirked behind his reading glasses, clearly enjoying the show. Richard felt the heat creep up his neck. No, nothing like that," he said quickly. "I just meant, I guess I assumed that I had someone else pay for my seat." Karoline finished for him. His breath caught. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't glaring, but she had laid it out plainly, showing him the full weight of his own words. She had given him every opportunity to stop talking, to rethink his assumptions, to realize his mistake before he humiliated himself. And now, she was standing at the exit, waiting to see how he would get himself out. The murmurs around them had died down, but people were still listening, still watching. The spotlight was on him now, and it pressed against his shoulders, making it hard to sit comfortably. He exhaled, forcing another awkward chuckle. "I guess I spoke too soon." Karoline didn't look up from her tablet. "You did." Richard swallowed hard, rubbing the back of his neck. He had walked into this moment entirely on his own, and there was no easy way out. The businessman across the aisle chuckled again, shaking his head. "You really don't know who you're sitting next to, do you?" Richard's jaw tightened. He hated being the last one in the room to understand something. Hated feeling like the joke had already been told before he even knew what was funny. He glanced around, noticing the way other passengers exchanged knowing looks, their quiet whispers like a low hum in the background. Karoline, on the other hand, remained perfectly composed. She offered the businessman a small, polite smile but said nothing, leaving the weight of the moment hanging between them. The businessman took it upon himself to fill in the blanks. "Karoline Leavitt wasn't just the White House press secretary," he said, leaning slightly forward. "She was the youngest person to ever hold that position. You don't land a job like that because someone hands it to you. You earn it." Richard swallowed hard, feeling the full impact of his mistake settle in. "She went toe-to-toe with some of the toughest journalists in the country," the businessman continued, now clearly enjoying himself. "Handled some of the most brutal press briefings we've seen in years, and if I remember correctly, she didn't come from money, no silver spoon, no handouts. Just talent, discipline, and a whole lot of hard work." Richard's chest tightened. His earlier arrogance had completely dissolved. It wasn't just about being wrong. It was about the fact that Karoline had never needed to prove anything to him. She could have shut him down the moment he opened his mouth, could have made him look foolish instantly, but she had done something much worse. She had let him do it to himself. Richard turned to her, searching for anything, amusement, satisfaction, even mild irritation, but there was nothing, no smirk, no look of triumph, just complete indifference. That, somehow, made it even worse. For the first time in a long time, Richard Dunn had no idea what to say. The weight of realization settled over Richard Dunn like a suffocating fog, thick and inescapable. He had spent the entire flight assuming he knew the woman beside him, reducing her to a stereotype he had crafted in his own mind without a second thought. And now, as the businessman across the aisle finished detailing exactly who Karoline Leavitt was, Richard could feel the heat crawling up his neck, his earlier confidence replaced by something much heavier. Embarrassment. The murmurs in the cabin had died down, but their absence only made the silence feel sharper, more suffocating. He could feel the shift, not just in how others viewed Karoline, but in how they now saw him. He had been that guy, the one who assumed, the one who judged too quickly, the one who mistook his own biases for reality. Richard exhaled slowly, forcing himself to glance at Karoline, hoping for some kind of reaction. Annoyance, smug satisfaction, anything that might give him a way to move past the growing knot of discomfort twisting in his chest. But she was still so composed. She wasn't looking at him, she wasn't reveling in his embarrassment, she simply didn't care. That somehow made it worse. If she had gloated, he could have defended himself. If she had snapped at him, he could have shifted the conversation, deflected, salvaged whatever dignity he had left. But instead, she had done nothing, and that nothing left him scrambling for words. Richard shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the armrests as if trying to ground himself. He needed to say something, anything, to lessen the weight pressing down on him. "Well," he finally said, forcing a chuckle that felt hollow even to his own ears, "I guess I spoke too soon." Karoline still didn't look up from her tablet. "You did." The response was so effortless, so final, that Richard felt the last remnants of his confidence wither. She wasn't being cruel, wasn't being sharp. She was simply acknowledging the truth. He had misjudged her. He had embarrassed himself. And there was nothing she needed to add. The businessman across the aisle smirked behind his reading glasses, clearly enjoying the moment. "You know, Dunn," he said, his voice tinged with amusement, "it takes a special kind of arrogance to assume you know a person just by looking at them." Richard bristled slightly, his natural instinct to push back almost kicking in, but he caught himself. He knew there was no defense here, no clever remark or smooth recovery that could erase what had already happened. He had lost this one. More than that, he deserved to. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. "I get it, okay," he muttered. "I misjudged her." The businessman smirked again. "Oh, you did more than that. You judged, dismissed, and then doubled down." Richard clenched his jaw, swallowing back the knee-jerk response rising in his throat. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of moments like this. He was always the one in control, always the one with the upper hand. But not today. Karoline, however, remained as steady as ever. She finally glanced up from her tablet, but not to engage in the conversation, just to acknowledge something much simpler. "I appreciate the support," she said to the businessman, "but I don't need anyone to defend me." The businessman nodded, clearly impressed. "Didn't think you did." And just like that, Richard felt even smaller. Karoline had handled the entire situation without ever raising her voice, without ever needing to prove herself, without even needing to acknowledge him as a real challenge. She had let him walk himself into his own embarrassment, and now she was letting it pass without a second thought. That, somehow, was the worst part of all. Richard exhaled again, forcing himself to shift the conversation, to move past the disaster he had created for himself. "Look, Ms. Leavitt," he said, turning to her again, this time with an edge of sincerity in his voice. "I was out of line. I shouldn't have assumed anything about you." Karoline studied him for a moment, her gaze steady, assessing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a small nod. "I appreciate the apology. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cruel either, just matter of fact. Just enough to acknowledge that she had hurt him, but not enough to make him feel better. And Richard knew, deep down, that was exactly how it should be. For the first time in a long time, he had nothing left to say. As if sensing the shift, the flight attendant returned, her smile still professional but noticeably cooler than before. She paused at their row, glancing between Richard and Karoline as if weighing something internally. Finally she spoke. "Mr. Dunn, would you like another drink?" Richard hesitated. Before all of this, he would have answered without a second thought. But now? Now he felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the cabin, waiting for his next move. He cleared his throat. "No, I'm good, thanks." The flight attendant nodded, then turned to Karoline, and this time her smile was genuine, respectful. "Ms. Leavitt, can I get you anything?" Karoline shook her head politely. "I'm fine, but thank you." The subtle difference in their treatment wasn't lost on Richard. Before this moment, he had been the unspoken leader of their row, the one others would defer to without question. But now, that dynamic had shifted, and he wasn't used to being on the other side of it. The businessman across the aisle smirked again. "Guess respect is about who earns it, huh?" Richard didn't respond. For the next few minutes, the conversation died down, but the tension remained. It was over, but the lesson lingered. Richard had assumed he was the most important person in this part of the plane, and he had been wrong. And as the flight continued, as passengers returned to their books, their conversations, their quiet thoughts, he sat with that realization, feeling it press against him in a way no first-class luxury could ease. Richard sat stiffly in his seat, his mind still reeling from the realization of who Karoline Leavitt really was. The echoes of the businessman's words lingered in the air, heavy and unavoidable. You judged, dismissed, and then doubled down. The truth of it stung more than he was willing to admit. He had spent the entire flight assuming, categorizing, and ultimately humiliating himself in the process. His earlier arrogance had melted away, replaced by an uncomfortable weight in his chest. He wasn't used to being the fool in the room, but now it was clear everyone had seen it. The businessman across the aisle had called it out directly. The flight attendant had subtly shifted her demeanor, and even the murmuring passengers seemed to recognize the shift in power. But the worst part? Karoline still wasn't rubbing it in. She hadn't taken satisfaction in his embarrassment. She had simply let him drown in it on his own. That, somehow, made him feel even smaller. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly as he tried to process how quickly everything had unraveled. It wasn't just that he had been wrong about Karoline. It was that he had been so sure of himself while being wrong. That was the real blow to his ego. He had built a career on being able to read people, on making snap judgments that led to smart decisions, on knowing who was worth his time and who wasn't. And yet here he was, sitting next to one of the most accomplished young professionals in the country, having spent the past hour treating her like a spoiled kid with a trust fund. He swallowed hard, glancing at Karoline again, hoping to find some opening, some way to ease the discomfort hanging between them. But she was still working, still unbothered, still carrying herself with the same quiet confidence she had from the moment she sat down. She didn't need to put him in his place. He had done that all on his own. The businessman across the aisle chuckled, shaking his head slightly as he turned another page of his magazine. Richard clenched his jaw, willing himself to let it go, but the silence only made the thoughts in his head grow louder. He thought about all the times he had dismissed people in the past, all the moments he had assumed he already knew someone's worth before they even spoke. How many times had he been wrong? The thought made his stomach turn. He exhaled again, this time more slowly, forcing himself to lean back in his seat. "You ever get tired of it?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Karoline glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Tired of what?" He gestured vaguely. "People assuming things about you, judging you before they even know who you are." She considered this for a moment before leaning back slightly. "It used to bother me when I was younger," she admitted. "I felt like I had to prove myself every time I walked into a room. But then I realized," she paused, her gaze shifting toward the window for a second before returning to him. "The people who underestimate me don't get to decide what I'm worth." Richard absorbed that, letting the words settle in his mind. She said it so simply, as if it were an undeniable fact rather than something she had fought to believe. And maybe, for her, it was. She didn't carry herself like someone who needed approval. She wasn't looking for validation. She knew exactly who she was, and she didn't need anyone else to confirm it for her. "Must be nice," Richard muttered, almost to himself. Karoline tilted her head slightly. "What must be nice?" He let out a short breath, shaking his head. "To be that sure of yourself." A small smile touched the corner of her lips, but there was no gloating in it, just understanding. "It takes time," she said simply. Richard looked away, staring at the seat in front of him. The businessman had gone back to his reading, but Richard knew he had been listening. Everyone had been listening. He had spent years convincing himself that he knew how the world worked, that he could take one look at someone and know their story, but today had proven otherwise. Maybe he wasn't as sharp as he thought. Maybe he had a lot more to learn. The flight attendant passed by again, and this time Richard caught the way she glanced at him, just briefly, just enough to let him know that whatever impression he had walked onto this plane with was long gone. And for the first time he felt it, not irritation, not defensiveness, but regret. He had been wrong, not just about Karoline, but about a lot of things. And maybe, just maybe, it was time he started seeing people for who they really were, instead of who he assumed them to be. Richard sat in silence, the weight of his own misjudgment pressing down on him like a physical force. The hum of the airplane engines faded into the background as his mind replayed every word he had spoken to Karoline Leavitt, every assumption he had made, every condescending remark that now rang in his ears with unbearable clarity. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to read people, and yet, in the span of a single flight, that certainty had unraveled. The businessman across the aisle had been right. He hadn't just judged Karoline, he had dismissed her outright, never once considering that he might be wrong. That realization sat heavy in his chest, an uncomfortable but necessary truth. He stole another glance at Karoline, who remained poised and unbothered, tapping away at her tablet as if nothing had happened. She wasn't ignoring him out of anger or spite. She simply had no reason to engage further. She had said all she needed to say without ever having to raise her voice, without having to put him in his place. She had let his own words do the work for her. And now she had moved on. Richard, on the other hand, was still sitting with the weight of his own mistake, the embarrassment of having been so wrong about someone so significant. It wasn't just about Karoline anymore. That was what made it so unsettling. How many other people had he misjudged over the years? How many times had he filled in the blanks of someone's story without knowing the truth? He had built his career, his identity on the belief that he could size people up in an instant. But today had proven that he wasn't as sharp as he thought he was. Today, he had been the fool. Richard exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. The old version of himself, the one who had boarded this plane just a few hours ago, would have laughed off this moment, found a way to dismiss it, maybe even twisted it into a joke at his own expense to regain some sense of control. But now? Now he wasn't so sure. The instinct to brush it off, to move past it without reflection, felt like a defense mechanism he no longer wanted to rely on. For the first time in a long time, he let himself sit with the discomfort. He turned slightly toward Karoline, clearing his throat. "You ever misjudge people?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. She looked up, raising an eyebrow as if deciding whether or not to entertain the question. Finally, she set her tablet down. "Of course," she said simply. "Everyone does." Richard nodded slowly, absorbing the truth of that. "And when you do?" Karoline studied him for a moment before replying, "I try to be better next time." The words hit him harder than he expected. There was no lecture, no grand statement about learning and growth, just a simple answer, one that carried the weight of experience. He had spent years convinced that his ability to judge quickly was a strength, but now he saw how easily that kind of thinking could lead to arrogance, to missed opportunities, to assumptions that hurt rather than helped. Maybe it wasn't about being right all the time. Maybe it was about being willing to adjust when you realized you were wrong. The flight attendant returned, making her way down the aisle with landing instructions, but Richard barely heard her. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the dozens, no, hundreds of moments in his past where he had assumed too much, where he had let his perception dictate reality instead of simply listening. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing the game better than most. But maybe the real strength wasn't in controlling the narrative. It was in recognizing when it needed to change. As the plane began its descent, Richard took a deep breath, glancing out the window at the Los Angeles skyline coming into view. He had boarded this flight thinking he was the smartest person in the row. Now he realized he still had a lot to learn. Maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Richard sat with his hands clasped together, staring at nothing in particular, lost in thought. The entire flight had shifted something inside him, something he wasn't sure he could ignore. He had boarded this plane thinking he had the world figured out, confident in his ability to read people, to categorize them, to decide who belonged and who didn't. And yet, here he was, sitting beside Karoline Leavitt, a woman he had completely misjudged, realizing how wrong he had been, not just about her, but about himself. The discomfort that had settled in his chest hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. How many times had he done this before? How many people had he dismissed without knowing their stories? He exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb over the seam of his cuff as he replayed the interaction in his head. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, giving their final instructions, but Richard barely registered them. His gaze flicked toward Karoline, who remained as poised as ever, gathering her things efficiently, completely unbothered by everything that had transpired. She had already moved on. He, however, couldn't shake the feeling that he owed her something more than just his quiet regret. Clearing his throat, he turned slightly toward her. "Look," he started, his voice measured but lacking its usual confidence. "I know I already apologized back there, but I meant it." Karoline paused, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder before looking at him. Her expression was neutral, not dismissive, not unkind, just measured. "I believe you," she said simply. Richard nodded, but that wasn't enough. He let out a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I don't even know why I said it," he admitted. "That 'daddy's money' comment. The moment I saw you, I filled in the blanks. I assumed I knew who you were." He shook his head slightly. "And I just went with it." Karoline studied him for a moment, tilting her head slightly, as if weighing whether or not to give him more of her time. Finally she spoke. "And now?" Richard swallowed. "Now, I think I need to start asking better questions before I fill in the blanks." A small smile touched the corner of her lips, not one of amusement or triumph, but of understanding. "That's a good place to start." He wanted to say more, wanted to explain that this wasn't just about her, that she had unknowingly forced him to confront something bigger than this one interaction, but he could tell that Karoline wasn't looking for grand gestures or long-winded explanations. She had never needed validation, not from him, not from anyone, and somehow that made her words feel even heavier. She turned toward the exit, taking a few steps forward before Richard called out again. "Hey." Karoline glanced back, waiting. "You ever misjudge people?" he asked, not entirely sure why he needed to know. She considered it for a brief second, then nodded. "Of course. Everyone does." Richard let out a breath. "And when that happens?" Karoline gave him a knowing look. "I try to be better next time." With that, she disappeared into the crowd of passengers disembarking, leaving Richard standing there in the aisle, feeling as though he had just walked away from a conversation that would stay with him far longer than this flight. He had spent his life thinking he had all the answers. Today, he realized he had barely started asking the right questions. Life has a way of humbling us when we least expect it. The story of Richard Dunn and Karoline Leavitt is a reminder that assumptions are often wrong and can prevent us from truly seeing people for who they are. Too often we judge others based on appearances, quick observations, or preconceived notions without ever stopping to ask ourselves, what if I'm wrong? Richard assumed he knew everything about Karoline the moment he saw her, filling in the blanks with his own biases instead of giving her the respect she deserved. But reality proved him wrong in the most uncomfortable way, forcing him to realize that his perception of the world wasn't always accurate. This lesson is especially meaningful as we grow older and reflect on our own experiences. Many seniors have been on both sides of this story, having judged someone too quickly or having been misjudged themselves. How many times have we looked at someone and assumed we knew their story, only to be surprised later? How often have we been dismissed because of our age, our appearance, or a single aspect of our identity that someone else decided defined us? The truth is, no one wants to be placed in a box, yet we do it to others all the time. Karoline's quiet strength throughout the flight shows us the power of self-assurance. She didn't need to defend herself or prove her worth. She simply let Richard's own words expose his mistake. That kind of confidence comes not from arrogance, but from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let others define you. There is also a deeper message here about humility and growth. Richard's ultimate realization wasn't just that he was wrong about Karoline, it was that he had been wrong about many people before her. This moment was a turning point, forcing him to confront how often he had let his assumptions dictate his interactions. And isn't that something we all should reflect on? No matter how much experience we have, no matter how many years we've lived, there is always room to learn, to grow, and to see the world with fresh eyes. It is never too late to challenge the way we think and to ask ourselves if we are truly giving people the chance to show us who they are. For older adults, this lesson is particularly valuable. Many seniors know the sting of being underestimated, of walking into a room and being dismissed simply because of age, of being spoken to as if they are irrelevant in a fast-moving world. But just as we don't want to be judged unfairly, we must also be careful not to do the same to others. The next time we meet someone new, instead of assuming, let's ask. Instead of judging, let's listen. We may be surprised by the wisdom, strength, and depth of the people around us, because at the end of the day, true respect isn't given based on status, looks, or assumptions. It's about who we are and how we choose to treat others.